Hi. So today we're going to be looking at converting between percents, decimals, and fractions. So we're going to begin with going from percents to decimals because for most people that's fairly easy. You see a percent has a decimal in it already. Fractions will be a little more difficult for people, but remember that fractions are just division problems, and we've already seen how to go from decimals to fractions. So a lot of times what you may have to do when converting to make things easier for yourself is to convert things into a decimal first to go to a percent, or from a percent go to a decimal and then back to a fraction. So we'll look at this all encompassing, but first we're going to start off with going from between percents and decimals. So let's start off with the percent. So say you have 20%. Now again, remember what percent actually means. It means out of 100, or this would be 20 per 100. So for every 100, you have 20 of them. Or another way to look at that would be 20 out of 100, or 20 for each 100. So if we think of what percent means as a definition, we can very easily convert this into a decimal. Well, how? Well, if I say it's 20 for every 100, another way of saying that, like as a fraction, would be quite easily this being 20 out of 100. And we know how to write that as a fraction, as a decimal. It would just be 20 hundredths, because that's exactly how we read that, 20 hundredths, 20 hundredths. Okay, so whenever changing from a percent to a decimal, that's one way of doing that. You can just say, okay, well, how much would this be out of 100, and then write that as your decimal. Okay, so that's your first way. So another thing that a lot of people like to do is they take the number that's here. So say instead we had 33 and 1/3%, and they want to change that to a decimal. Well, what we can say is we can take this number and just divide it by 100, kind of like what we did here, but we did that in order to see how to write it. Well, if we do that here, we get 33 and 1/3 out of 100. Well, you can't put that as a decimal. That doesn't make sense. However, we can. If we see the fact that this is a 1/3 here, and this also will help you whenever you're converting from a mixed number percent to a decimal or a fraction. So what we could do at that point is we could then multiply by 3 in the numerator and denominator to get rid of the third. And so when you do that, in this column, you end up with 99, because 3 times 33 is 99, plus 1 more, because 3 times a third is 1, over 300. Okay, so if we were to add it together, we would get 100 over 300, which would just be 1/3. And we know from our common fractions what that is. So 1/3 we saw before is just the same as having 0.3 repeating. Okay. Another way that we can do this is actually the most common one done. And you can do it with the other two numbers as well. It doesn't matter what kind of percent you have, you can always do this. And this is when you have something where you have a decimal. The decimal in this case would be here. Technically there's a decimal after this whole number, and then this would be the remainder, the 1/3. So what you would do in this instance to change from a percent to a decimal, see how each time we've been dividing it by 100, because the percent is how much it is out of 100. Well, if you take a number and divide it by 100, honestly what you end up seeing is that the decimal has moved 2 places to the left every single time. The decimal has moved 2 places to the left. In this case, we have 3's repeating all day. So it was here, we had 3 in front, so we moved the 2 decimals to the left. The same thing is going to happen here. So the common thing and common way that's taught to go from a percent to a decimal is to move the decimal 2 place values to the left. Or why are we moving 2 place values to the left? Well, remember with our place values, they're all based off of powers of 10. So when we're dividing by 100, 100 is 10 to the second power. Another way to remember that is it has 2 zeros here. So therefore, because we're dividing by this, we need to move our decimal 2 places to the left. In other words, this number needs to get smaller by two place values. Okay. That also will be helpful for you in the future whenever if you're dividing by 1,000 or 10,000 or multiplying by 1,000 or 100. Because then you'll know you need to increase your place value by how it remaining zeros if you're multiplying, and decrease by how it remaining zeros if you are dividing. So that's another helpful tool. But in regards to the percent, if we move this over 2 places to the left, we end up with 37.5% is the same as 0.375. Okay. And so these are all ways to take a percent and go to a decimal. Well, you kind of may have already figured out how we can reverse these to go the opposite way, to go from a decimal to a percent. So let's look at that. So let's say, for instance, that we have 0.45, and we want to change that to a percent. Well, to change that to a percent is how much it is out of 100. So we could multiply this by 100. And if we do that, we end up with 45%, because this is how many we have out of 100. Out of 100, of is another keyword to multiply a lot of times. So we're doing 0.45 of 100. So 0.45 times 100, that means that would be 45% of it. Okay? So that's one way to do it. Another way, let's say we have 2/9. Well, if you remember with the repeating decimals, and actually, we'll just say what this is as a repeated decimal. If you have a 9 down here, this number is going to repeat. This digit is going to repeat. So we have 0.2 repeating. So this would just be a bunch of 2's going on all day. So if we had a repeating decimal such as this, and we want to represent this as a percent, well, we can do the same thing. If we multiply times 100, then it would move our decimal over 2 places to the right. We can look at it that way as well now. So for some people, this might be difficult though, because you don't see any other digits. So a lot of times it's best to go ahead and write this out. So then now you can see how things would change if you move this over. And in this case, we get 22.2 repeating percent. Now, when you have percents, we don't like to write the repeating decimal most of the time. So what we like to do is change that part back to a fraction so that we have a mixed number as our percent. So this will be 22 and 2/9. And generally speaking, when you have a repeating decimal, you will see it, or in some kind of shape or form, you will see it again here. Okay. All right. So that's really simple. Whenever you're changing from a decimal to a percent, you multiply by 100. Whenever you're changing from a percent to a decimal, you can divide the number by 100. All right. So that's pretty simple. And we already know how to go from a decimal to a fraction to a decimal. Well, is there an easier way to just go from a percent to a fraction? Well, let's take a look. Because to go from a fraction to a percent, like we just saw, we first change that percent to a decimal, and then we can convert from there. There's actually another way. Let's say we had 3/25, and we want to change that to a percent. Well, what does percent mean again? Percent means out of 100 or per 100. So we're looking for how much this is out of 100. Oh, well, you all at this point have looked at proportions, or you've seen how to solve this. Another thing you can do is you've seen this with equivalent fractions. You've seen how to solve these. So what number times 25 will give you 100? That's right, it's 4. So we can also multiply this by 4, and we end up with this being 12 out of 100, or 12%. So 3/25 would be the same as 12%. Okay. So if you have a fraction, what you can do is you can either convert it to a decimal first, as we saw in the last example with the 2/9, and then from the decimal convert it to a percent. Or if from the fraction you can get to the denominator to become 100 by multiplying or dividing, do the exact same in the numerator, and the numerator will be what your percent is. So we did not do that with 2/9. Why? We didn't want to do that with 2/9 because you can't very easily say, what would you multiply 9 by to get to 100? Right? It's a little bit more difficult to do. So because of that, we kept things a little simpler. by changing this to a decimal first. That's when we got that 0.2 repeating. And then we change that to a percent. And that's when we got the 22.29%. Okay. Now, as I said before, though, let's look at, is there another way to go from a fraction to a percent easily? And there is. This has to do with the fact that, hey, I know that if I have, or go from a percent to a fraction, I know if I have 78%, what does that mean? Percent means per 100. So really this is 78 hundredths. And so you've already seen this. And so that's it. That's all you would do. You would just change it to a fraction by putting it over 100. Okay. You got to make sure you simplify though. So in this case, we can simplify both of these by dividing by 2. And so we end up with 39/50. All right. That's not bad at all. So to change from a percent to a fraction, you can just put it over 100. We saw the example earlier when it was a mixed number. We can still do that. We just have to get rid of the mixed number by multiplying by the denominator in the denominator of the mixed number. So that was when we had the 33 1/3%. We did 33 1/3 out of 100. We multiply both by 3, numerator and denominator, and we got 100 out of 300. And then we reduced it there and got 1/3. Okay. So these are all the ways that you would use to convert between the two. Going from percents to fractions, just put the number over 100. This also is useful when going to decimals many times, because then you can just see this would be 78 hundredths. And so you can write 0.78. You also can move the decimal 2 places to the left when going from percent to decimal, because your number should now get smaller. So you need to move it 2 place values back. You also can go from decimal to percent by doing the opposite, as we saw earlier. And if you feel like it's going too fast, you can go back and you can also hit pause throughout the video so that you can take it at your own pace. I want to show you one fraction that may seem a little more complicated, just to finish things off here, going from that to a percent. And I'll leave you with it to finish up on your own if you like. So let's look at the fraction 1/7. Okay, well, sometimes I said it may be easier to convert it to a decimal first in order to solve it, because you can't just say, well, 7 times 1 gives me 100. It's a little difficult to do. You could do that if you wanted to, but again, that might be a little difficult to do. So something else that we can do, though, for certain, is that we can divide this. So what we're going to do is we're going to say, how many times does 7 go into 1? Well, 7 goes into 1 0 times. 0 times 7 is a 0. And then we subtract that, and we end up with a 1. We can add a decimal and a 0, just like we looked at when we were dividing decimals. Bring that down. We have 10. Well, how many times does 7 go into 10? Once I put my decimal up here, it goes in 1 time. And 1 times 7. Subtract that, you get 3. We can add another 0 and bring that down. And again, I am going a little faster, but that's just for sake of time. You can always hit pause between this. You can review dividing decimals if you are having any issues with this. 7 goes into 30 4 times. And then 4 times 7. 4 times 7 will give us 28. We subtract that, we get a 2. We can add another 0. 7 goes into 20 2 times, and that gives us 14. Subtract that, we get a 6. Add a 0. 7 goes into 68 times. Subtract that. 8 times 7 gives us 56. We get a 4. Bring out a 0. 7 goes into 40. 5 times. 5 times 7 gives us 35. Subtract that, and we get 5. Bring down a 0, we get 50. 7 goes into 57 times. 7 times 7 is 49. Subtract that, we get a 1. Bring out a 0, we get a 10. And we see that it's going to repeat from there. So this is the same as 0.142857. And this is the same as 1/7. Okay? So it repeats. 0.142857. 0.857. So it has 6 digits that repeats. That's a lot of digits. Okay, I'm sorry. How do we then convert this to a percent? Well, we have it in decimal format. We know we can move that decimal over 2 places to the right, and it'll change it to a percent. So this will be the same as having 14.2857. All of this repeats. Okay? Well, we talked about this. We don't like to have things repeating, right? So what else could I do in order to solve this? Well, I know that this is going to repeat, so this will be 14.285714. Okay, that's not bad. I can do that, right? I can deal with that. So when we do that, then only this part has to repeat because it'll start again at 285714, 285714. But this whole number is perfectly fine. Okay, that's cool, but we still can't have the repeating part there because we need to write it as a mixed number most of the time. How do I do that? Well, what I then can do is say, okay, I have these repeating, and I know how to take a repeating decimal and write it as a fraction. I just write my digits that are repeating and put it over that many nines. I then could reduce it from there. And that would be fairly simple. In this case, you end up with 2 sevens if you did that. So you can look at that in practice. There is another way to do this though, without having to divide all that. What you could do is say, hey, remember this needs to become 100 down here. So let's just take 100 out of 7. 7 goes to 100 14 times with the remainder of 2. And then you'll have 2 sevens if you were to write it as a mixed number. So just something else to think about. Because as I said, if you have a decimal, you can multiply that decimal by 100 and you'll get your answer. Well, a decimal can also be written as a fraction. So what we could have done for this problem to get the exact same thing, and that's our final answer down there. Instead of changing it to a decimal, we can take our 1/7, or our fraction, and multiply it times 100. In this case, we get 100 over 7. And you guys know how to convert from an improper fraction to a mixed number. So we divide 7 into this, and we end up with 14, and we'll have a remainder of 2 that will be over the 7. So you get the same numbers. If you have trouble seeing that, 7 would go into 100, 7 goes into 10, 1 times 7 goes 7. Subtract that, we get 3. We get 30, 7 goes into 34 times, and then you get 28, and remainder of 2. So you could then convert from there. All right, that's converting between percents, decimals, and fractions. When converting from a percent to a decimal, we just need to divide the number we see in the percent by 100. Simple as that. Or you can think of it as move the decimal over 2 places to the left. Right? To convert from a decimal to a percent, you do the opposite. You multiply the number by 100, you move it over 2 places to the right, the decimal. If you need holes filled in, you can use 0 as a placeholder. We've seen that in other videos before. To go from a percent to a fraction, just remember you can take that number and divide it by 100 and then simplify from there. If you have a mixed number there, you may have to multiply by whatever the denominator is on the fractional part of the mixed number in order to get whole numbers for your fraction to reduce. When going from a fraction to a percent, you can just take the fraction multiplied times 100 and then reduce from there, and that will be your percent. You can also change it to a decimal first and then convert from decimal to a percent. One last thing that you can do with that is you can think, what do I need to change my denominator? What I need to multiply or divide my denominator by in order to get it to become 100? Do the same in the numerator, and you'll have your percent. So that is converting between percent, decimals, and fractions, and I will see you soon.